the second topic we're going to talk about is training until failure. I see so many posts on TikTok where these really young TikTok influencers say, I always train until failure. If you want to grow muscle, you got to train until failure. You don't have to train until failure, but the science does support training until failure may help increase muscle hypertrophy, muscle size growth at a higher rate than if you were to train with a few repetitions in reserve. So what I mean by repetitions in reserve, let's say you have it set, your bench press is at 100 pounds and you can only lift the 100 pounds for 10 repetitions until you're totally at failure. You're just not going to get that bar up after you hit 10 repetitions. And if instead of going until 10 repetitions, you went up until 8 repetitions, that would be 2 repetitions in reserve. So you've got 10 repetitions as your repetition max for 100 pounds. If you only do 8 repetitions, that leaves 2 repetitions in reserve. So a lot of strength and conditioning coaches actually promote their athletes to stop with repetitions in reserve instead of going until failure for a couple reasons. First and foremost, obviously, are injuries. One of the most common injuries that happen to either elite, collegiate, high school, or recreational weightlifters are injuries from overreaching. When you're overreaching, you're basically making yourself work harder than you're able to sustain at that level. So you're trying to do training that is too advanced for you at this certain time. So let's say if you're just a high school athlete and you're trying to train at the same level of some Olympian, you have to realize that that Olympian has so many more years of training experience that their body is more capable of sustaining the stress of high intensity training than a high school athlete is able to sustain over an extended period of time. So that's one of the reasons that can lead a person to overreach. One of the biggest benefits of training until failure for increasing muscle size is that this maximizes the volume that a person is lifting. So volume is huge when it comes to growing muscle. That's one of the biggest reasons, one of the biggest things when it comes to the workouts that can lead a person to be able to gain more muscle. And if they're going up to their absolute limit, theoretically that would mean that they can maximize the amount of muscle growth that they're able to get from their training. But there's also things that you also have to consider. So when it comes to exercises that require more technical expertise in doing, such as a squat or a deadlift, this is where a person has to be a lot more careful about training until failure. So one of the reasons why a lot of strength and conditioning coaches encourage their athletes to stop with repetitions left in reserve is that going until failure, especially usually around 1 to 2 repetitions in reserve, that's where the technique starts to break down. So you'll start noticing a person, whether they're squatting or deadlifting, their back starting to bend a little and their knees starting to cave in a little, things like that. Some little technique breakdowns starting to pop up because the person is, their only goal is to try to hit the maximum number of repetitions. Like when you see a lot of weightlifting competitions, and if you were really to judge them only based on the quality of their technique, there's a really good chance that all of them, their technique isn't that great. It's not because they're not proficient in doing these workouts. They're absolutely proficient in doing their workouts. Like Hafthor Bjornsson deadlifting 1,105 pounds. That's totally that's the epitome of of technique proficiency, because there's no way that he would even have been able to train to a level that allows him to lift that much weight if he wasn't technically sound. So I digress. Like I said, during the competitions, because they're really only doing their 1 rep max, their only goal is to lift that weight for the 1 repetition. And that's why, yes, technique is actually going to break down, and it's common. It doesn't mean that the person is going to suffer an injury during the competition. It's just that person is doing everything that they can to get the weight up. But you're not in competition. If you're just training in the gym, you shouldn't be trying to go for the maximum weight in a repetitions, the maximum repetitions in certain weights all the time, because as technique starts to break down over the course of an extended period of time. So let's say you've been training until failure for 5 years, and you've been racking up those repetitions where your technique has been breaking down. After a certain amount of time, that's going to add up in the long run. And that's one of the reasons why you have so many people, especially recreational weightlifters, having suffering from chronic back pain or knee pain, shoulder pain, because they've been pushing themselves so hard for so long without allowing themselves to stop short of their point of failure. One way to increase the amount of repetitions you can do until failure is by increasing the rest time. So this depends on how much weight you're doing or what type of training that you're doing. Are you going to be doing heavy weight, low repetitions, or lightweight, high repetitions, or somewhere in between? Someone who's somewhere in between will usually range between 8 to 12 repetitions, and the rest could range anywhere from 90 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 3 minutes, somewhere along those lines. If a person is doing much heavier weight, they might require 3 minutes and above, probably 3, 4, 5 minutes. A lot of the power lifters, like from the World's Strongest Men competitions, since they have to train to lift a whole lot of weight, some of them actually rest for 10 minutes or up to 15 minutes. Some, I'm sure, actually rest a lot longer than that. So does this mean that I'm suggesting that you shouldn't train until failure? Absolutely not. There are some exercises that I would encourage, that I do encourage my own clients to go until failure, but you have to be specific about which exercises that the person is doing. My biggest thing that I'm looking at is safety. Is this person at risk of suffering an injury if they go until failure? If they're doing something like a deadlift, there's a high risk of injury in that exercise. If they're going until failure, if they're just trying to pump out as many repetitions as they can, as opposed to somebody who's just doing like a preacher curl, a single joint exercise, I would feel way more comfortable with them going until failure with that, because there's really nowhere for them to go. Their arm is already resting on the bench, and all they're doing is moving the weight up and down. There's really no hardcore technique specialization that is necessary with the preacher curl as opposed to something like the deadlift. Also, if a person is doing something with lightweight, so let's say I was having a person go 20 to 30 repetitions, so hoping that that range will get the person to failure by doing just a goblet squat. Since the weight is already light enough for the person to be able to get at least to 20 repetitions, I can feel comfortable that that person probably isn't going to suffer an injury as detrimental as if they were going for their 3 repetition max on a regular back squat. And most machines are designed to allow people to be able to perform repetitions until failure in a safe manner. So something like a leg extension, if you can't get the legs raised up, you're absolutely under no threat of injury. Uh, by doing that, since you're already sitting down, just lifting your legs up and down, there's really nowhere that you'll be able to injure yourself. So just remember, if you do decide to train until failure, have no shame in stopping with repetitions in reserve if you start feeling your technique starting to break down. Because remember, those repetitions, when the technique starts to break down, they add up, and those are the things that tend to lead towards chronic injury. So just remember, chronic means that it's going to take some time for it to start showing its ugly face. If you've got parents or uncles, aunts that have back pain, knee pain, shoulder pain, that didn't happen all of a sudden. They didn't just wake up, oh, with my back hurt. No, then more in all likelihood, if you're someone in your teens or in your 20s, they are probably just as mobile, just as athletic, maybe even more so than you when they were your age, but they ignored the the precautions that could have led to the injuries that they are suffering from right now. You don't want to continue that cycle. Instead, you want to make sure that you avoid injuries at all costs. So I hope this helps. If you have any other questions about training until failure, feel free to check out my website and I'll be more than happy to help.